Welcome to another episode of Ask the Lawyers. This is the podcast where we tackle your legal questions no matter how big, small, or complicated they might be. As we always start, I am Evan Schwartz, the founder of the law firm Schwartz, Conroy, and Hack.
I'm Matt Conroy, Evan's partner.
And we always have to start with our little disclaimer, which I am going to read for you now. The information provided on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Watching this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship with any of the attorneys featured or the firm. Please consult with a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction regarding any legal matter you may have. And with that, we're going to get right to our questions.
Do you have any guidance on how people can choose the right lawyer for them?
Definitely. For starters, if you have someone who you truly trust to put you in the hands of not just one law firm, but maybe 2 to 3 law firms for you to choose, that trusted advisor is a very important link to getting the right legal representation. I, myself, and Matt are considered trusted advisors in that regard, meaning there's a lot of matters that our firm doesn't handle, but a lot of people come to us and say, I have this particular situation. Do you have a law firm that you think is competent to help me with it? And we refer a lot of clients to who we believe to be competent lawyers who will do a good job for those people. On top of that, if you don't have someone like us that you could rely on, then I will tell you, for starters, AI is an incredible tool in terms of getting advice on lawyers in your general area, lawyers with the expertise for the problem that you're looking for. It's a way to narrow things down. And then to make sure you speak to the lawyer looks at the documents related to your case, and that you communicate in a way that you understand that this lawyer knows what they're doing, practices in this specific area, and that you're comfortable hiring to represent you in that case. Definitely you want to make sure that they have, for the most part, unless you've got a very strange set of facts, that they're in that practice area doing that type of work in the area or the region for which you need that representation.
Yeah, and you can ask those questions when you speak with the lawyers. How many cases like this they've had? You know, whether or not they've been successful is a little bit subjective. And a lot of times, you know, whether you win cases, lose cases, settle cases, get divorces done, get criminal cases resolved, you know, those are hard answers to quantify sometimes. So it's not so much their success rate. Nobody can really answer that, but whether somebody has experience in a particular subject matter is super important. And you can ask, how many cases like this have you had? You know, do you represent plaintiffs? Do you represent defendants? Do you regularly appear in this particular court? Do you know this particular judge? Those are important questions to ask.
Right. And then one of the questions that I think, you know, Matt talks about a lot too is, if I'm going to come on board with your firm, who am I going to be working with? And how is the process going to work inside of your firm so that your expectations align with what this firm or this attorney is going to do for you?
When we have clients come in, I introduce them to the team, the people that they're going to deal with, the people they're going to talk to. I tell them how to communicate with me, how to communicate with them. It's important from the outset to be clear. You know, if you need somebody at 10 o'clock at night, who do you send an email? Do you call the office? Do you text me? Ding, ding, ding. That's the answer, by the way. But, you know, understanding how you communicate with your lawyers is super important.
My partner and I are starting a business. What should we be talking to a lawyer about?
So one of the things that we see happen all the time is partners come in 3 years into the business, a dispute's arisen between them, the operating agreement that they have doesn't address the situation at all, and they each have their own take, and the business starts to fall apart because they can't communicate, they can't make decisions, nothing's really happening. That probably could have been avoided at the outset if they had gone to good counsel, and that lawyer's expertise in understanding and in potentially anticipating what the partnership problems might be. Good lawyering, especially in the context of corporations, small businesses, and partnerships, is anticipating events happening and then dealing with them in the contract so that if something comes up 2 years from now, you open the agreement and says, oh, this is what happened, this is what's supposed to happen. By way of example, oftentimes people go into a business and it's not clear who's going to do what. You're going to have someone in the back office. You're going to have somebody out on the road generating business. You're going to have someone who's the tech person, somebody who's the sort of face of the company, the person that generates the work. Understanding how the responsibility of operating the company or generating the work or doing the work gets divided between the business owners is incredibly important. When it's not discussed, when it's not addressed in the agreement, it's easy for, sort of subtle resentment to start brewing over the years. And then when the dispute ultimately comes to bear, you look at your contracts, it's not addressed at all. And now you're sort of in la la land. One partner sues the other partner, and now you've got this sort of mishmash in the company's dude. So good counsel early on identifies lots of different instances: death of a partner, disability of a partner, a desire for someone to buy out the other partner, bringing on a third partner, failure to, delegate your time and attention to the operation of that business full time. These are things that, sometimes they're in the general operating agreement, sometimes they're not. But good counsel raises those issues up front, allows you to discuss them with your partner and come to an agreement before you go down the road. That's good general advice in almost every legal situation where people charge ahead and don't want to get a lawyer involved because they think it's going to be expensive or it's unnecessary. And what they wind up doing is creating a much more expensive and emotionally and legally difficult problem for themselves by not having done that up front. And when you're forming a business and you have a partner or multiple partners, the business lawyer is going to help you with structure, risk allocation, and responsibilities and the what ifs. And it's not a super expensive process. I understand that it's the start of your business, and so therefore you may not have as much capital. But if you're going to start the business, you should allocate some capital to get that lawyer to give you the basic things you need: the structure of the business, what you need to protect yourself for the risks inherent in that type of business. Typically that's going to be insurance and liability protection through the formation of an entity, right? Those are basic things that you need to have out of the box, and an agreement just to make sure that roles and responsibilities are there, and what happens when the most major things go wrong, that it's addressed. Yeah. Penny wise, pound foolish, right?
Correct.
Spend a little bit of money up front. It's going to save you a ton of money at the end.
What qualifies as workplace discrimination or retaliation?
Well, that's a broad question. It's also depends on where you are. If you're in New York City versus the rural suburbs of Georgia, it's going to be very different. And I'm going to kick that over to Matt, but I want to start with, where are you? Because the laws can be very, very, very different depending on what state you're in and what city you're in.
There's a federal anti-discrimination statute. There are, in New York, for example, there's a statewide discrimination statute, and then New York City has its own human rights law. And typically, you are protected if you're a member of a class, and the classes tend to be: age is its own class, disability, gender, sexual preference, place of national origin. There's probably 7 or 8 different categories. Discrimination happens when your condition of employment has been materially altered because of your inclusion in one of these classes. And it takes one of 2 forms, essentially. The first form is where it's quid pro quo, where either your boss, a supervisor, the owner of the company will essentially say, your employment is going to change unless you do something for me that is based on your inclusion of one of these classes. The classic example would be a sexual harassment claim, where quid pro quo means you're going to go on a date with me as your supervisor, or there's going to be some change. You're going to be demoted. You're going to go to the basement. Your hours are going to be cut. Your salary is going to be cut, something along those lines. There's a second form of discrimination that essentially is hostile work environment, where it's not necessarily a quid pro quo, meaning you do something in exchange for something, but that you are being subjected to some form of harassment that's conditioned upon your inclusion of one of those classes in such a way that it would be unreasonable for a person in your position to tolerate that. And typically it's a sexual harassment, hostile work environment where, there are sort of lewd jokes, or there are emails being sent around with sort of, depraved sexual pictures or things along these lines. And it's pervasive, it's repetitive, and ultimately, whether it's a coworker or not, the discrimination happens when you make a complaint to a supervisor, to HR, to an owner, and they fail to address the hostile work environment. It is their failure to address the environment that constitutes a violation of your rights, and that itself is the discrimination. The second part of that question has to do with retaliation. And once you make a complaint, as an employee, whether you're complaining on behalf of yourself or for somebody else, if you make a complaint about workplace discrimination, no matter what its form, and the job takes any action against you whatsoever to alter or change your work environment, it could be where you're sitting, what you're paid, what your hours are, what duties you have, anything whatsoever. If that change in your work environment was based on you having made a complaint, that's a prima facie case of retaliation. Whether or not the underlying case was true makes no difference at all. The purpose of this is to basically to promote employees' willingness to come forward and address instances of discrimination in the workplace. The state, the federal government have an interest in making sure that people feel free and protected to raise issues like this to HR, to their supervisor, to their boss, to the owners of the company, without having to fear the company turning on them and basically saying, we're going to show them and we're going to make an example out of them. That's sort of the genesis of those rules.
Now, it's a perfect example of, how do I find a good lawyer? Obviously, Matt is very knowledgeable in this practice area, and we're both familiar with it somewhat, but we don't practice in this practice area. But we would be people that you would ask, who's a good lawyer for me to talk to when I've been experiencing what I believe to be harassment or discrimination? And finding those lawyers and what we just talked about when we answered the question of how to find a good lawyer, all those things apply.
Yeah, and we know, just by way of example, we know employment lawyers who represent companies. We know employment lawyers that represent employees. We have people on Long Island, we have people in the city, we have people in Massachusetts, people in DC, people in Virginia. Depending on your case, who you are, where it is, jurisdiction, and this goes back to, how do you find the right lawyer for the right case? Depending on where you are and where you're situated, a different lawyer might be right for you as opposed to somebody else.
Great.
So I came home and there was a lawsuit sitting on my front stoop. What should I do?
So when you've been sued and you discover you've been sued, one of the first things you need to do is not avoid it. Pick it up, look at it, and typically if it is a civil lawsuit, which it most likely is, you're talking about getting sued, there will be a summons. The summons is going to tell you that you have to take some form of action by a certain date in a certain time frame. So the first thing is, how much time do I have to deal with this? Know how much time you think you have. You may have more, but assume the shortest amount of time based on what you're reading in the summons that, hey, I need to deal with this by X date. So, if you pick it up and it's July 1st, it may say you have 20 days to do something. So you better make sure that by July 21st, you've done something. You don't want to be in default. That's the first thing. The next thing is read what it says. Understand what it is. And now you're beginning the process of, okay, I'm getting sued. This is what I'm getting sued for. And now I need to decide how to deal with this. And if how to deal with this is now I need to find a lawyer to help me, then we can refer you back to some of our answers to questions on how to find a lawyer. But the two biggest things I would say is find out how much time you think you have to deal with it. deal with it within that time frame, and understand what the claims are being made against you, meaning the facts. What is this? Are you being sued because someone says you breached a contract to pay for your landscaper? You're being sued because someone says they slipped and fell on your property 2 years ago and now they want money? Are you being sued because it's something involving a business that you're in? What is it? And what do I need to do with it? So those are to me, the most important things you need to do.
Yeah. When we get calls from people saying, look, I got home and there was a summons complaint on my door, our first question is, what's the case about? What are you being sued for? And being able to answer that question somewhat concisely, and again, you're not a lawyer, but you can read. And typically, in a civil complaint, it's going to have causes of action against you. It's going to probably say in the first 2 paragraphs what you're being sued for. Understanding whether it's a slip and fall on your property, in which case you want to probably notify your homeowner's policy, and they will probably undertake the defense. You want to find out, are you being sued for sexual harassment by a coworker at your job? In which case you want to call your job and say, hey, I just got sued. Are you going to cover me? 3, you're being sued because you're an accountant and you're being accused by a former client of not filing taxes on time, right? Understanding what it is, there may be coverage for that through somebody's insurance policy, yours or someone else's. But understanding that simple first question from any lawyer, what are you being sued for, is probably the second most important thing.
Right. And the first thing the lawyer is going to want, besides your interpretation of what it is, can you send me that summons and complaint? And do you know how much time you have to deal with this? Because the lawyer wants to find out whether or not, how quickly the lawyer needs to get involved to avoid you being in default.
One thing that you probably should not do is call the number and the lawyer that's listed on the summons and say, what is this about? What do you want? Why are you so?
That is good advice.
You'd be surprised how many times I hear people do this. It's not a great idea. If they were willing to just dismiss the case or let you out, they probably wouldn't have brought it in the first place. And they spent typically considerable amounts of time, energy, and money bringing it in the first place. So your call to them is probably not going to resolve the matter, even if you fully believe, and even if you truly had no exposure.
And you don't want to be by saying things to the lawyer that could constitute some form of admission. Well, I know I screwed this up, and I know that I had left a hole in the front yard when Mary fell. You don't want to be doing that. You want to make sure you got your team on your side to deal with this problem, whatever that team is, law firm, employer, partnership, whatever.
And just to follow up Evan's first point about timing, the sooner you call someone to start dealing with it, the better off you are. The fact that you find it on your doorstep on Monday doesn't mean that the case was filed on Monday or even the week before. It may have been filed weeks earlier, and you don't know what the plaintiff is filing with the court. You don't really know when your answer is due until somebody looks into it a little bit further to determine when the plaintiff is representing to the court that you were actually served.
I have a wife and 2 kids. Do I need a will?
Well, first of all, the minute children come into your life, you need estate planning documents. You need getting the most basic things between you and a spouse to determine what's going to happen with your children if something happens to one or both of you is critical. In general, estate planning for the most basic adults is simple things like a power of attorney, a will, a healthcare proxy, a living will. And I cannot tell you how much aggravation and difficulty can arise when something happens to somebody and they don't have those documents. Sometimes you get lucky and you'll be in a situation where a spouse or a child can deal with a lot of things. But when it comes to financial things, when it comes sometimes to medical things, if you don't have the basic documents that you need, like a healthcare proxy, like a power of attorney, that a lot of times if husbands and wives got married and now they had things in their separate names and separate accounts, and all of a sudden the spouse that has control of those is no longer able to make decisions They're sick, they're in the hospital, whatever. The other spouse can't do anything. They're frozen, right? And then if something happens to one or both of you as parents, it's not even the question of where are you leaving money to. It's who's going to be responsible for them when you can't be responsible for them. Who's their guardian? Is it your sister, your mother, your uncle, your friend down the block? Because if you don't have anybody for that, that choice is going to be made by somebody other than you. So having the basic estate planning documents in place to deal with these things is really, really important. And people don't think about it because you think you're young, you're in good health. What could possibly happen? You know, for people like who live on Long Island, who drive on the LIE, they know what can happen. Okay? Car accidents happen still every day, and they can be really dramatic, and they happen all over the country. Bad things happen, or you get sick and you don't, I mean, COVID, if nothing, taught us a lot about people being intubated and in hospital beds and not being able to do anything. And so having that basic planning, and it's not complicated, it's not expensive, it's form-driven. There are a lot of lawyers that can do it. There are legal companies that do a lot of this stuff. Are they great? Not necessarily, but they're reasonably priced so they can give you the basics of what you need. So go out and get that stuff, especially if you have children.
Yeah, part of the rationale and the purpose of estate planning and wills in particular is to avoid unintended consequences. And every state, what ends up happening, if you die without a will, the laws of intestacy of the state that you were residing in at the time of your death govern the disposition of your assets. And depending on the state, it's some combination of sort of layers of heirdom, so that your spouse might get 50%, your children get the remaining 50%, divided equally among them. People don't necessarily even realize that that's the case. And depending on the age of your children, the length of your marriage, it may be that, you have children of prior marriages and, you got remarried 6 months ago. And when you pass, 50% of your estate passes to your new spouse and 50% goes to your children. Well, maybe your spouse needed the whole thing to live on. Maybe you didn't want to leave her anything. Your wishes are not factoring into this. It's simply the laws of the state that you live in their rules of intestacy, which is how property passes when somebody dies without a will.
Yeah, and they basically do it based on relationship. So as Matt's saying, it's spouse and children. But if there's no spouse and no children, then it's siblings. And if there's no siblings, then it's parents. And if there's no parents, then it's grandparents. And at a certain point, if there's nobody like that, then it all just goes to the state.
Right. And there's also an element of tax planning that goes into this. And, good estate planners will use trusts, sometimes generation skipping trusts, to minimize the amount of estate tax that your heirs and beneficiaries and family members are going to have to pay to the government. And, depending on what your estate situation is, if you're in the under $1 million range, it may not be that critical for you. There might not be any tax consequences. But if you're in the $5, $6, $7, $8 million range, there can be considerable tax consequences to your children and your spouse if you die without a will. And it's important to sort of do that planning ahead of time to try to limit that exposure.
And I'm going to tell you again, there's a lot on AI about stuff like this in general. Like if you go on to AI and you ask a question of, I'm recently married, I have 2 young children, what kind of estate planning documents, and I live in New Jersey, what do I need and why do I need it? And they will give you a whole laundry list of the reasons why you need to do something, what the basic things are. And then they'll ask a question. AI will be like, would you like me to find local lawyers in your area to see if you want to do these things? And boom, they'll populate that too. So you have at your fingertips, especially with AI now, a lot of good information to help guide you in terms of these basic legal needs that you really should have in place. And it's not complicated, so do it.
Speaking of car accidents, I just got into a car accident. I'm on the side of the road. What should I do? And what will happen next?
Matt.
So the first thing you do is you call 911. Call the police, get the police there right away. It's incredibly important that you get a police report that documents who was there, what they said, the identity of the other driver, their insurance information. You should exchange insurance information with the other driver. Obviously, to the extent that you have any, medical episodes or conditions at all, you should get medical care if necessary, get transported to a hospital by ambulance if it's warranted. But it's incredibly important that first call is probably to the police.
I agree. You want to make sure everything's documented. You want to make sure that, everyone in most states, we'll use New York where we are now as an example. Every car out there on the road is required by law to have insurance. Okay. And so 99 times out of 100, the driver that you are in an accident with will have insurance. And your own insurance company needs to know about that. They're going to need to know about this accident. And so at the end of the day, dealing with all that, making sure you have that information and then you tell your insurance company about the accident, really critical. Now, that's secondary to call 911, get health care if you need it in whatever way you need it, and get the other driver's information. And use your phone, if necessary, to take pictures of license plate, their driver's license, their insurance card, whatever you can get. The more information you have available to you if needed, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, when the police arrive, they'll speak to you and they'll ask you how the accident happened. They'll also ask you whether you're injured. And oftentimes people don't really know the extent of their injuries at the moment or within a few hours of the accident, because if you have soft tissue injuries, for example, you have swelling, you have adrenaline, there's a lot that goes into it where you're not feeling pain. You might feel it the next day. You might not feel it till 2 days later. But what ends up happening in many, many, many cases is that you end up saying to the police officer, I'm fine. I'm not injured. That then goes into the police report. And when you file a claim later, you're following yourself up a little bit. You were telling him honestly that you weren't injured, except now 2 days later, you're feeling terrible pain. A week later, you can't move your head at all.
So I have a criminal record back from when I was in college. Nothing very bad. Can I get my record sealed or expunged?
Right. So the rules are different in different states, but in New York, for example, the rule more or less is that you can have 2 misdemeanors or a combination of a felony and a misdemeanor. And as long as those crimes were more than 10 years ago, you're not on probation, you don't have an active parole situation, and your felony wasn't a Class A felony, typically, a sex offense, a gun offense, a homicide. In those cases, you can file an application with the court to expunge your record. You could almost do it yourself. I typically would say, reach out to counsel that can handle this, but it's got to be, the last conviction has to be a minimum 10 years ago. There can't be more than 2. It's either 2 misdemeanors or a misdemeanor in the felony, and that felony cannot be an aggravated account, sexual, homicide, gun charge.
A serious felony.
Yeah. So it's possible.
I don't have anything to add to that other than I would say definitely consult with a lawyer and make sure the lawyer, A, is competent to handle something like this, but B, they have the full record of whatever criminal convictions you're seeking to expunge so that they can tell you whether they think it could even happen and then what they would recommend as far as the process. And then you can determine whether you want to hire them or a different lawyer or try to do it yourself.
Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you on the next one, which will be coming very soon. And just a reminder on the disclaimer one more time. The information provided on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Please consult with a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction regarding any legal matter you may have. Watching this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship with any of the attorneys featured. Take care, everybody.